My parents came to Cleveland, Ohio from Michigan, where I was born in Cleveland, the only one in the family. And my father was a foreman of millwrights who had a team of men who traveled around the country setting up big machines and factories to make huge parts for automobiles and whatever. My mother, with all the kids she had, she was a housewife.
What did they do for a living, Ed?
I mentioned my father. He was a millwright, foreman. And my mother was a housewife, and a very good one, too. She baked bread. It was fantastic. My education was in the Catholic parochial schools in Cleveland, Ohio. I went to 2 different ones. As I got older, we moved, and I went from one parish to another. My high school was John Hay High School in Cleveland, Ohio. And it was 2/3 girls and 1/3 boys. Hooray. So that was the extent of my education, high school.
And where were you, and what can you remember when the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor?
My wife and I were living at 89th and Superior with our daughter. It was a Sunday morning, and the news came on the radio about the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who later on sent me a little letter, he had a heck of a speech. He was a fantastic president. The very finest thing that we ever had in the war was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he was not only a great president in the wartime, but he also, before that, created the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, where they took young men out in the wilderness woods in the Northwest, trained them, and made them men. And that was Franklin Roosevelt. He was the best president since his predecessor, Teddy Roosevelt.
So you were married at the time?
Yes, I was. Well, my wife was married too. It was a couple, and our daughter was just a year old.
And you were employed?
I was employed at Fisher Body Division, General Motors Corporation at Coit Road plant in Cleveland, Ohio. I was a payroll auditor when Franklin Roosevelt sent me greetings. Your friends and neighbors have selected you. Well, I checked with all 4 of them, 2 friends and 2 neighbors. They said they had nothing to do with it.
And what were your feelings about Japan, Italy, and Germany at the time?
It was totally negative on all 3 of them, because none of them were friends of ours, and Hitler was the worst nightmare the whole world has ever seen. Since barbarian times, there was never a war like this in history, and we hope there'll never be another one. I was drafted in Cleveland, Ohio, went to the induction center there after I got my letter from Franklin Roosevelt and took it to my draft board. We didn't have any copy machines. I wish we had. I'd love to have had a copy of that notice. Anyhow, we went from there to Fort Dix in Columbus. From there we were given winter uniforms and everything we needed, and they were consulted on life insurance and our pay. And I wanted all of my pay to go home to my wife. And an officer sat down and said, you better save some money. You got to have some money for toothpaste and stuff like that. So I said, okay, I'll settle for $2 a month, $6 a month. And that's what I got the rest of my time in the military. It was $6 a month. It was stupid, but I wanted my wife to be getting the balance of it. And we went from there to Fort Polk, Louisiana, for basic training. We got there on Easter Sunday morning. It was horribly hot there that day. We had winter uniforms on. They got us out and beside the train. We're standing there at attention in ranks, and a couple of the guys started to pass out and fall, and they finally got smart enough to get us into barracks. That's where I had my basic training at Fort Polk, Louisiana. I was in the 535th, I was in headquarters company of the 535th Armored Infantry Battalion. That was basic training. In it, like all basic training, you work your butt off, you do what you're told, hands and hips to clear up the area. All they wanted to see was your rear end and elbows. And then we had the usual 4 S's, and before you had breakfast, and you had the orders for the day from the previous evening. You had to have the right uniform on, and whatever the training was, they outlined that. If it was going to the firing range or a 5-mile hike, you had to do that. You had to have all the equipment they told you to have. It's typical basic training. No big deal. Nobody fell out or anything like that. So that was basic training. I went to the barracks one day, and a young man there was packing his stuff up into a barracks bag. I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going to the airport, the Air Force." I said, "How'd you do that?" He said, "I sent a letter to the commanding officer, and he gave me a transfer." I sat down right away and wrote a letter to the commanding officer, and I got transferred to the Air Force. Wound up at University of Alabama, where we had to go to class every day. This was kind of a holding deal. We had to take tests and physical and mental and all that stuff. Well, I qualified to be, to my horror, I wanted to be a fighter pilot, but I qualified for pilot, bombardier, and navigator. That spells bomber. Well, I didn't care. I was in the Air Force. Well, we were getting ready to go to pre-flight school, and the commanding officer of the unit was called down to the 8th Air Force headquarters in Florida, and the result was that for the convenience of the government, all men who went to the Air Force from the ground forces had to go back to the ground forces. I wound up with the 65th Infantry Division in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. I was given a leave of absence, 3 weeks. I came back, and there were orders for me, and I had to take a physical, and I was transferred to Memphis, Tennessee. At Memphis, the 8th Army headquarters was being formed under the tutelage of George Patton, and he had, I think, the 6th Army there. And we were trained as the 8th Army headquarters. I was appointed to the G4 section, which is Army Supply. And after the training was over, we were set to go overseas. Now, while I was at Memphis, Tennessee, my wife came to visit me, and she got a job in the PX, which was great. She earned a little money. She went back home. And because of that visit, we begat our first son. I didn't know that. But in August of 44, they loaded us on board a train. There was a new set of wheels there for troop trains, a great setup inside, and we traveled through Texas, all the western states, through the deserts, and we had to stop out in the middle of the desert for some reason. Must have been for at least an hour. Never know why. We wound up at Pittsburgh, California, on part of the inlets from the San Francisco Bay. And there they loaded us onto ferry boats, took us out to the docks outside of Frisco, and we had to climb aboard the nets that they dropped on. They didn't give you an easy way to get on. They wanted to train you. We got on board ship, and it was a brand new ship, the General John Pope, built for this purpose. And once we were all loaded, we took off for nobody knew where. None of us did, anyhow. And it was kind of strange because I'm sure every man who ever was on one of those boats, whether it was the Atlantic or Pacific, boats on the ocean have a combination of motions. Number one is a chugging back and forth a little bit, then a side-to-side roll a little bit, then a back and forth roll, up and down, on that central axis. Well, most of us had never known about that. So a lot of guys got seasick. We were ready for a meal, and I got in line to eat, and the officer came along and said, "How do you feel, soldier?" I said, "Fine." He said, "Will you pull some KP for me?" Sure. I did. It was the greatest thing because I had to get seasick. I knew all about the horizon. You got to know about that and see it as often as you can. On the trip over the Pacific to our destination, I spent most of my time up in the bow of the boat. I was lucky. And I could see the porpoises and the flying fish, and you could see the horizon. We never had a storm, never had a rough sea. When they fired the 5-inch guns for practice, we could sit there on the deck and watch the shells leave the barrels of the guns. You could see those shells going out into the distance. It was fantastic. We wound up on the east coast of New Guinea, which is a narrow inlet like the fjords in Norway, with the mountainsides coming right down to the water, and all forested, of course. The ship went to the very end of that narrow channel. They stopped there and they offloaded something, took something on, and we left. We went back out to the ocean, went across the north coast of New Guinea to Lae, L-A-E, which was one of the ports that we captured from the Japanese. And of course it was all American now, and at night you could see the trucks and that going back and forth along the coastal road. We were there probably 4 or 5 hours, and by that was over, we took off again, going northwest a little bit along the coast of New Guinea to a place called Hollandia Bay. And the name Hollandia Bay comes from the fact that that was an occupied territory by the Dutch. That's why it was Hollandia Bay. It was the best harbor on the whole island. And we went into the harbor, and they even had a dock there where we could go down the nets again and put our feet on wood planks on the wharf. And that's how we got to New Guinea. Our headquarters was located inland about 3 or 4 miles, right near a lake, Lake Sentani. And it was a beautiful lake. None of us knew that that lake had no outlet, visible outlet, as most lakes do, or inlet from streams going into the lake. So a few of the guys who were good swimmers decided to go swimming. One of them was a champion swimmer. He'd never made it out of the lake. So that lake was off limits from that time on. So that was what happened on New Guinea at headquarters there. And it was a very fascinating place to be, with the jungles. And another guy and I took our rifles and we took a walk out in the forest. I knew my way around. I have an automatic compass in my brain, I guess. We found a huge tree there. It must have been about 3 or 4 feet around, at least minimum, or in diameter. It was a mahogany tree. Fantastic thing to see. So we got back and went on our business, and we had to do what we had to do. We were clerks, mostly. And after the time was passed to make our way to the Philippine Islands, we were all loaded on board ship again, and we took off in a convoy, 2 lanes of boats going up to the Philippines. I was lucky. A number of us got on board an Australian boat, and that was great because it took us 2 days to get tuned into the Australian way of pronouncing the English language. And it was two lanes of ships with a couple of destroyer escorts or something up in front. We were going along there, and all of a sudden here comes a Japanese plane right down the center of that corridor of ships. And that guy was smart because he knew they couldn't shoot at him because they'd be shooting at each other. And he left, and that was it. Got to Leyte Island, and there's no harbor there. In fact, it's so, for thousands of years, that's on the eastern, the lee side of Leyte Island, all of the sand from the beaches washed out into the ocean. So the ships had to stand out to sea about 1.5 miles or 2 miles to unload and get onto the beach. That was our arrival at Leyte Island. While there, we had to set up pup tents on the beach with our shelter halves and that, and slept on the ground. It turned out to be the rainy season, which was a lot of fun. Fortunately, being on the lee side of the island, we didn't get any heavy downpours. It's mostly drizzle and light rains. When we ate from mess kits, you got water in your mess kit. But so what? You know, the food was good. And eventually the engineers put up squad tents for offices and sleeping quarters and all the rest of that. Fascinating stuff. And that we started in the business in Leyte Island to help with the war effort as a general headquarters. And I think MacArthur was stationed there also. We never saw him. And the commanding general of 8th Air Force was General Eichelberg from Ohio. Never met the man, but he was a good general. And our function there as clerks in 8th Army Headquarters, G4 section, the Signal Corps people, messengers, would come in with orders from the various units in the field in the battles, needing this, that, and the other thing, and we clerks would have to sign for those things and then pass them on to whoever in the enlisted group was told to deliver these to the various officers in the back quarters who had to take care of getting the supplies to the troops. It was a daily thing and no big deal. We knew what we were doing. Everything went fine until one day. One officer didn't show up. Nobody knew why. And I had no idea who took the message back to where he was supposed to be or what happened to it then. I knew nothing about that. I didn't care. But as soon as I found out what had happened, I immediately sat down. I made up a form that from then on, whenever we took a message back to an officer to be acted on, that officer had to sign with his initials and put down the time that he got the message. Because I didn't want to have any enlisted man be a scapegoat for an officer. Well, it turned out that there was going to be a scapegoat, and I was the one. I was the last EM to join the group back in Memphis, Tennessee. I was a PFC. I didn't care because I wasn't going to be anybody's scapegoat. It turned out that as time went by, apparently one of the officers back there, who was a pretty sharp guy, a graduate of one of the Ivy League schools in Boston, his father had a seat on the New York Stock Exchange, and this guy was a whiz at poker. He would clean the clocks of all the officers in the outfit. Every time they played poker, he'd take all their money. Well, word got around that the second in command of the unit was a lieutenant colonel, a West Point graduate, and I didn't know this was going on, but he wanted to find a scapegoat. To give you a little background on this man, there were two officers in charge of the unit. A bird colonel, Tubby Burgess, great guy, and I forget this other guy's name, but when we were on New Guinea, I got a babygram from the Red Cross. My wife had our first baby son. Lieutenant Colonel, West Point graduate, he got a babygram. His wife had a girl. He went bananas. Goofy as a devil. Here he is, an educated man, a graduate of West Point. Maybe he was the last in his class when he graduated, I don't know. But he wanted to have me court-martialed. Well, this one officer, when he found out what had happened, and he knew I was the author of this form they had to sign for, when the messages got back there, he must have talked to the colonel, Tubby Burgess, and a small unit was set up to handle the supplies for Philippine guerrillas only. That was the sole purpose of the group. So there was this man, he was a first lieutenant, and he had a second lieutenant as his subordinate. And they wouldn't let him have me. He wanted me. He couldn't have me without taking in another non-com. There were only two in the unit, a buck sergeant, great guy, smart guy, and a master sergeant, an RA guy, regular Army. How he ever got to be master sergeant, I'll never know, because I think when he ran out of fingers and toes, he couldn't go over 20. He didn't know the alphabet. Well, he was in the group of four of us, and word came in that there was a Japanese supply depot somewhere on the island. He told the master sergeant to go out and find that depot. He took the jeep and he took off. He was gone about 2 hours. Came back. He couldn't find it. The officer said to me, Heights, I hated the name, but that's what he called me. Can you find it? I said, it's on the island. I'll be back. Got in the jeep, took off, and about 5 miles up the road toward Tacloban, where the airport was. And I saw an MP at a T intersection. I stopped and I said, I'm looking for a Japanese supply depot. Is there any around? He said, it's right down the road. I found the depot. There was an infantry outfit camped right next to it with their tents and all that. I found out what their outfit was. I went back to the headquarters, told the officer where the depot was, and the engineers could find it. And I told him the name of the outfit that was camped right there. Everything was fine. It took me about half an hour, max. From then on, I had no problem in headquarters 8th Army. In fact, the officer, I got some special privileges, like he had me go out on a duck and learn how to drive one of those out in the ocean and stuff like that. And there was a time when a Corps commander landed on the airport, came to headquarters, and he asked me if I could take the Corps commander back to the airport. I said, sure. But I thought I was going to take the Jeep. No, there was a command car. These are big babies. They're trucks. And you have to double clutch, shifting from one gear to another. And it's heavy stuff. When you put that clutch pedal down, you got to go all the way to the floor, hold it there till you pull the gear shift lever out, and then let up, and then put it back in again, move the gear shift lever to the next shift point, and let up in the clutch again, and away you go. Well, I never even had a chance to practice that. But I got the guy. He was a bird colonel. We didn't say anything to each other. I didn't jump out and salute or any of that stuff. I was fed up with saluting anybody. Anyhow, I took him up to the airport, and there were no roads there to show where you could go beside the airport to get to where you wanted to go, and I didn't even know where the hell to go. So I turned between two revetments, and here was the airport landing mats, the metal landing mats, between the landing mats for the planes and these revetments where they sheltered the planes in case there were any bombs falling in the airfield. So I pulled in toward the landing mat, and I was making a left turn in first gear, moving into second gear. Here comes a fighter plane taxiing in our direction, and apparently going to where it had to go for service, whatever. The only problem was this plane was slowly converging toward us, and I couldn't get the darn thing into second gear to get the hell out of there. Excuse my French. So this fighter plane, the right wing of that plane, hit the windshield post on the colonel's side, bent up just a little bit, and then slid over. And I thought, oh my God, if those propellers don't shut down, it's going to chew us up. It went down. A sergeant jumped out of that plane. He came racing over. He's going to tear me apart. I got out of the car. I said, you write your report and I'll write mine. I got back in the car. He saw the bird colonel sitting beside me. He went back to his plane. I wrote my report and never heard anything more about it. Anyhow, so there's some fun and joy in the military too, you know. Even though it's stupid stuff, these things happen. And you handle them, that's all. No big deal. So that was part of the story at Leyte Island. We heard the part of the Battle of Leyte Gulf when the Japanese had a battle group coming across the north end of Samar Island, which was just north of Leyte. There was a big strait through there where they could come through their big battle group and destroyers and escorts and all that stuff. And there was just a small bunch of tin can American boats called Taffy 3. And they were able to beat those guys because when they were able to get some shots into that battleship, the guys were smart. They looked for something at the top of the boat, like radar towers, that sort of thing, to try to knock them out. And they did it in one case, I guess. But we didn't know what was going on. Later on, I found out that there was a second Japanese battle group coming from the other end, south of Leyte, up through a very narrow passage between Leyte Island and Mindanao Island. And the Japanese were planning to have a pincers movement to get to Leyte and kick the crap out of headquarters 8th Army. So, it didn't happen. our Navy people had some boats, enough boats down on the southern end of Leyte. They crossed the T, which is a classical naval maneuver. You're able to whip the pants off that naval group from the Japanese coming through the Surigao Straits. That was the end of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The next episode in my life in that theater was I was supposed to go on a mission, and then no, I didn't know anything about it. We wore khaki uniforms in the headquarters, and I was not told to wear anything different. And I was going on a mission of some kind. Didn't know what it was, told where to go, and the officer gave me his .45 caliber underarm pistol to take with me. Okay. So I took the pistol and got aboard this boat, and the buck sergeant was going with me because I couldn't go without a sergeant or non-cap. I didn't know that, but that's what it was. We got on both this LCI, landing craft infantry, and he disappeared, and I spent my time out on deck on that thing, and it was full of troops. This was a 2nd Corps 108th RCT. That's a regimental combat team. They were going to perform an assault operation on one of the villages on the northern coast of Mindanao. But before we got there, when we left Leyte, it turned into nightfall. We now, on the ocean, we were going down to Mindanao Island. We landed on a coast to the left in the dead of night, black as anything. In the movies, if you saw that on the screen, you'd think it was gorgeous, this landmass rising out of the sea ahead of you. We went up on the beach, and down the beach a ways, they had a huge bonfire going for the guys who were going to be getting on our boat to take part in this operation. Well, there were 2 boats in this group, the LCI for infantry and an LC gun, I guess it is, because they had anti-aircraft weapons on them. They were Bofors weapons, 2 barrels. They go side by side and put up a rain of fire, and they had 2 sets of those, one on the front, one on the back. They had 50 caliber machine guns, that sort of thing, and we finally got on board our boats and we took off, going west along the coast of Mindanao. We pulled into the standing point off the coast of Mindanao, and both boats opened up fire to the beach. In one, they had tracer bullets in these rounds, in the 50 cals, and also the anti-aircraft guns, which they lowered to aim at the beach. I think it was, the name is in my records, the name of that barrio, that town. One thing was very weird. One of the rounds, 50 I guess it was, went into the beach and took it hit something, went straight up. Strangest thing I ever saw. Magical. Well, that was over. There was no fire coming from the beach against us. We got down the ramp to go to the beach, and this one officer came to me and said, "Here, I want you to go with this group here." It was a bunch of Filipinos, and they were the guerrilla force, but these actually were members of the Philippine National Guard that General MacArthur had set up years and years, decades before, when he was out in the Philippines. And these guys all had Thompson submachine guns with belts of ammunition across their shoulders and down their waists. They had hand grenades all over them, and they were loaded down. I don't remember how many there were, but the paper says there was I forget the term for it, but there were enough of them. And I had a .45 caliber. So we had to cross a little creek and turn into a field, and we went through there, and this one guy in charge of these guys, he was a little guy, maybe a corporal. I don't know, but I was in charge because I was an American GI, right? So went through this field of grain, and there's a hutch in the middle of it, and I thought, oh my God, if these Japs are in there with a machine gun, we're dead. But there wasn't anybody there. Got through the field up to a dirt road going south from the beach. They were going to go down the middle of that road. I said, we don't go down the middle of that dirt road. We get off into the left, going off to the fringe of the jungle. That's where we're going to go. That's where we went. All of a sudden there was a big bang, rifle shot. I heard a slug go right past my right ear. Just like that. Stop. We all did. And I should have dropped down and immediately gone forward to try to set up an attack on this guy, but too late. Another shot came up. Another slug went by my left ear. Same thing. And we had to go. Because these guys weren't going to do anything, and I only had a pistol. So we took off, and this guy said, "We got to go see her." We took off. I didn't know what their mission was, where they were going to go. But we started off and we went, and we didn't hear any other sounds of gunfire, nothing from our left, because we were the only force going on that side of this barrio going south. And the rest of the crew, all the soldiers, the force, they went to the left to go to that barrio and clean out any Japs if there were any there, and then head south. I didn't know what their objective was. We went down this road, about 2 miles or so, and we finally got to a T intersection. The T road coming from our right. And these guys were going to stand out in the middle of the road and said, here's a barrier down here, swallow and wallow in there. We got off the road and got down into that. And I told this young guy, I said, we got to have a guy out here in our right flank, 50 feet or 100 feet in that direction. We have to have another one the other way to guard our rear in case any Japs should come from that direction. So we heard a lot of gunfire on the left-hand side. It was tremendous. A huge torrent of weaponry. And I said to this little guy, I said, "Is that Japanese or Americans?" He said, "Oh, they're Japanese. They're the BAR." I said, I didn't tell him, but I knew they were our other force. They were shooting for effect, I guess, because I didn't hear any counterfire. When they finally got to the end of their mission, they turned to their right because they knew they were at this T intersection. That's what their objective was. They came out of the forest. We got up out of this little hollow thing and greeted them. So that was the end of our mission. I never shot a weapon. Never killed anybody. Didn't do anything heroic. But we got there. We were there when they showed up. So that was the end of my combat mission in Mindanao Island. But it wasn't quite the end, because once we got back on board the boats, oh, by the way, that ricochet, it had hit a Japanese officer, had a steel helmet on his head. It hit his head, took the helmet off, and took the top of his head off. He was laying flat on the beach, his brains spread out. We got back aboard, went west on the coast of Mindanao to another landing point, and the mission there was to go to a guerrilla headquarters on the Mindanao Island at Lake Lanao. So we got up to there, somehow we got a truck or something to haul us over there, and we got out, and the officers had stuff to deliver to this commanding officer of this guerrilla force there. I didn't go there. I stayed out there. They had a marketplace in the middle of this little barrio, and around the marketplace they had posts. They had barbed wire strung around all four sides of that barrio. That was a marketplace for the Moros on the island to be able to come and trade with the villagers from Christian villages, to trade one thing for another. But they always had guards posted outside the fence with machine guns to make sure the Moros didn't try to kill anybody. And the reason for that is, when I was a kid in Cleveland, Ohio, selling newspapers for the Cleveland Press, I would read the paper. Excuse me. Every so often, I'd see a small article about the Mindanao Island, and the Moros had raided a Christian village and killed people. And here they were. I saw some of them. They were hateful-looking people. They had hate in their eyes when you saw them. Didn't bother me. I didn't hate them. But they apparently hated us. So, when we were leaving that area, excuse me again, we got back to the road going down to the beach, and here was a truck, and it was right-hand drive. The keys were in the ignition. Nobody knew how to drive it. I said, get in, I'll drive it. Well, I knew darn well the transmission had to be the usual H pattern. So I checked the pattern of the gears, and it was an H pattern. So I turned the engine on, got everybody in, and we took out for the beach. So I got them there, and that was it. Got back to the headquarters, and that was all over. That's my story about combat. I didn't have any. One thing that happened on Leyte Island, and it happened on New Guinea also, was they had the planes, cargo planes, C-46s, C-47s. There was a mission deal down to Australia for headquarters contacts and that. And every time they went to Australia, they would bring back booze. Well, not for the troops, but for the officers. Well, the officers, the two officers I worked for, they always made sure I got a bottle of booze. That was cool. And we spent a lot of time there. The guys who had more money than I did would play cards and pinochle mostly. And it got real foggy one night. And I happened to be wandering around, nothing much to do. And I heard a plane go overhead from the Gulf, right over our headquarters, heading inland. And I wanted to get to the Signal Corps. I didn't know where it was, to get them to contact the Air Force headquarters, the airport, and tell this pilot to get altitude, because about a mile inland there was a headland. I don't know how tall it was, but it was probably 300 or 400 feet. And I thought, if he comes in any lower, he's going to hit that thing, and it did. He came in the next time around. We didn't hear it, but there were 13 men died that night because he couldn't find the airport, and there was no way to contact him. I felt so guilty about that, because if I had only known, well, actually, it wouldn't have happened, because I could not have gotten to the Signal Corps to tell them the story and tell them to get the word to the airport, tell that guy to get up higher. There would never have been enough time to do that, but I suffered over that for a long time. And there was nobody there to make a difference. So now we can talk about correspondence with the home folks, my wife and so on. And when you're in the military, all your mail going out is censored, or it doesn't go. So when I was in Camp Polk, Louisiana, my mail was censored, and I didn't pay any attention to that. I'd get letters from home, and everything was fine. One of the sergeants there once, he approached me. He said, would you mind having supper with me and my wife in my quarters? I'm shocked, me? Why me? I didn't say that, but I said, sure, I don't mind. I'll be over. So, being a regular Army man, he had quarters on the base with his wife. I had supper with him. It never occurred to me that he must have been reading my mail to my wife, and he knew as much about me as I could say to my wife. But anyhow, that was an experience. But it had an after effect, because after the war was over, my wife and I and our 3 kids were living in a house in southwest of Cleveland. The phone rang. We were getting ready for lunch. And I answered the phone, and here was this sergeant. That group and the 535th Armored Infantry Battalion had gone to Europe under Patton, and they were part of the Dagger Force. They went in and rescued the guys in Bastogne, Belgium. That horrible deal that they went through there. And every man in that unit was decorated. Bronze stars, silver stars, the whole 9 yards. And he was fine. That was something. Had I not transferred to the Air Force, I would have been with them. And I would have been just as happy and as miserable as they were, because you had to slog around in mud and all that stuff. But it didn't make any difference. But this same thing seemed to follow, because all the mail I sent home was censored. And after things cooled down quite a bit, There was my wife's birthday was on July 24th. She was born the same year I was. We were born 4 months apart, and 4,000 miles apart. She was born in Czechoslovakia. And by the good Lord's wishes, we both went to the same high school. Well, I didn't know her until the last year in high school. We had a meeting together. There was an explosion. She grabbed a piece of paper out of my hand and took off, and that's the last I saw her. Anyhow, I fell in love with her, and we got married, had 3 kids. But the officers at the headquarters, 8th Army, they read my mail. One day I was going to send her a birthday card on July 24th. I forgot to put the day in there. So I sent the card. One of the officers said to me, he said, by the way, what day of the month was your wife born? I didn't realize he'd read the card, you know. I said the 24th. And doggone, somebody penciled or inked in the 24th on my card to my wife. So it was a sweet kind of story. It makes your heart warm to hear those things. Because people care about people in the military, and all these scenes you see of the Band of Brothers and all the rest of it, it's all true. You read Audie Murphy's book, To Hell and Back, and as he said in his book, there are thousands of men who should have gotten medals and never got them. But that's war. But anyhow, I had some stories in my wartime experience, and now I'm home, and I have a cap that I wear a lot, and it says World War II veteran. And people come up to me and they say, thank you for serving. In the strangest place in the grocery stores, in the library, wherever I am, people approach me and tell me that. And I have to tell them there are 14 million people in that war. You better shake a lot of hands. But that's the way it was. That's the way it is. My brother was the only real hero in my family. My brother John was 2 years older than me. When he was born with a cleft palate. And it was a horrible disfigurement for a child. But when he was 22 years old, he finally had the kind of surgery that made him acceptable to everybody. And he was before that, too. But he enlisted, I believe, in the Navy after I was drafted into the Army. And he became a Navy medic. As a Navy medic, he served in the same theater that I was in, except that he was on the beaches on the jungle islands with the Marines. Saipan, Tinian, they're both jungle islands, and they had airfields on them. That's why we wanted them, because we wanted those airfields for our fighter planes and bombers and whatever. So it was terrible fighting on those jungle islands. The last island was Iwo Jima, the worst battlefield in the entire war. 8 square miles dotted with pillboxes sunk in the ground, concrete, they could raise up with machine gun emplacements and start firing, killing our troops. And every man who was on that island was a hero, no matter what. And I didn't know anything about this until after we got home. And I did talk with my brother, but we never talked about, the only thing he talked about was the fact that he loved the series on TV, MASH. He said that's the way it was. And he also loved where they went for R&R. There's a Kauai Island in the Hawaiian Islands. That's where the medical group always went for R&R after every battle. And he told me about only one wounded man that he took off the field on Iwo Jima. He said he was so badly wounded he had to put almost everything back into his body just to be able to move him. They got him to the field hospital, the MASH unit. He was in the triage program. He was the last man. Nobody expected him to live, but he did. That was the end of the story at that point. Until when we got home, my brother passed away of cancer 2 years before Clinton ever came into power as president. In the first State of the Union address that Bill Clinton had, in the balcony was a Medal of Honor winner from Iwo Jima. This man got up on the balcony. He said to the whole world, the man who should have gotten this medal, and he was wrong in that case, because he won it, honestly. But he said, was the medic who saved my life. There's no way of knowing who that medic was, but I believe it was my brother. When he left the service, he didn't leave as a sailor in the Navy. He left as a Marine because he loved them. When Franklin Roosevelt expired, it was a terrible shock to everybody, including everybody at home and everybody in the forces. He was a fantastic president, the very best that could ever have been there when this war started. But before that, he also created the Civilian Conservation Corps, where young men were put to work in the Northwest in the forests out there, in the lands that the country set aside for parks. And he also had the WPA, Works Progress Administration, where people have been desperately poor because of this huge depression. It gave them work to do in the national parks and the city parks, and they built bridges and they fixed beaches, all kinds of things. My father-in-law, who came here from Czechoslovakia, was a hard-working man. He got a job with the WPA. It turned out that a good friend of his couldn't get a job on that. So what this fantastic man, my father-in-law, did, he would give his work card to his friend so he could work a day with that card, and then my father-in-law would work another day with the same card. That's the way people were. Marvelous people, wonderful people, Americans all the way. And then Truman became president. And we were getting ready for the invasion of Japan. And it was hell on wheels because things were fast and furious. We spent hours sitting on our butts with messages coming in for supplies and all that. And it was real hurry up now because we were going to fight the battle in Japan on the homeland. And everybody knew that if we ever fought Japan on its homeland, we would have at least 1 million American casualties. No question about that. And once we got to Japan, I could see why. It's a mountainous island. And they were fantastic people. They were furious. They were horrible fighters. They didn't care how they killed you or when they killed you. Excuse me. Now, when the war ended, we didn't know about the atomic bomb because they don't tell you this stuff when you're out there in the theater. It's a big deal, you know. But when the war ended, and all this hoopla was going on in the streets in every city in the country and all over the world, headquarters 8th Army was dead silent. Until the 2 officers in my unit I was in, they showed up, each one of them had 2 bottles of whiskey in each hand to take to the tent, the group I was with, the enlisted men, to celebrate the end of the war. That was so funny. The rest of the base was dead quiet. Nobody was celebrating. Nobody was singing, but we were singing all the patriotic songs, and we were drinking a little booze and stuff like that. And about 4 o'clock in the morning, here comes a master sergeant from another outfit. He's going to shut us down. And he walked in, here's a major and a captain. Man, he turned around and left. That was so funny. Anyhow, that was the end of the war for us. We did get to Japan. When we sailed into Tokyo Bay, it was a sight to see because the entrance to Tokyo Bay is a narrow entrance, cliffs on both sides, mountain sides really. There are big sheets of white hanging down from each side. We went into the bay, and here's our battleship group out there where the surrender was signed. And Yokosuka Bay was their main Navy headquarters. That was on the left. We proceeded on to Yokohama, where we landed. That was where our headquarters was going to be for 8th Army headquarters, for MacArthur, Nykelberger. And we set up in a building that was perfect, but the entire city of Yokohama was level, and most of Tokyo was level from the fire bombs that were dropped. So we set up in the headquarters there, and that was our headquarters building. And the people who had been there before, I don't remember, it might have been a military building. I'm sure it was. But they had these ancient little trees there. Forget the name of them, but they had instructions on when to water them and that sort of thing. And they had some Japanese who did some work around the building, and we could see a couple of these guys sitting on the stairs down below us. They're having lunch, and they had their little cup of stuff, and they're using chopsticks to eat their lunch, which was neat to see. We saw the women on the streets in Yokohama, and when they had their clothes on, their traditional Japanese robes, they were gorgeous. The children were like little dolls. It was coal black hair cut right straight across the brow, and they were beautiful to see. But another guy and I, we decided that we're going to take a walk through Tokyo. So we grabbed our rifles and went up to the railroad station, and we waited on the platform for a train to come in so we could go into Tokyo. Yokohama is a suburb of Tokyo. On the other platform across from us, there were two women with our usual bags. Everybody in the Orient travels with bundles. And this one woman set her bundles down. She had a baby in her arms. She handed the baby to her companion, and she took robes off until she was bare from the breast up. And he was standing there agape, We'd never seen anything like that before in our lives. We knew some of the Filipino women worked in the fields bare from the waist up. But in Tokyo, a huge city, a metropolis, to see that in the main railroad station, it blew our minds. Anyhow, we went into Tokyo. We wandered around, and we saw the Imperial Palace and the guards out in front. And one old gentleman stopped us, and he started to jabber at us in Japanese, talking about his hands, the fire bombs and that. Well, we said, "You started it." And we turned around and left him, and went on our way. It wasn't until we got back to base we found out no American troops were supposed to be in Tokyo. We were. Nobody knew about it except us. So that was it for Tokyo and Japan. Since I had all the points I needed, being married with kids and that, I was one of the early ones out. So we were transferred from our headquarters to a place up on the mountainside. It had been the west point of the Japanese army. And they had trenches all over the place. And the soil in those trenches was completely black all the way down to the bottom. All volcanic ash. Rich soil. While we were there, it was high ground, and we could see, looking down on the fields surrounding us, they're lush with crops, green crops, beautiful. And there was a little hutch down below, and the family came out every morning. They're down on their hands and knees picking out weeds. And they're industrious people. They had to be, because they had to feed everybody. They had to grow the crops to do it. So it was an experience. When we finally left and got aboard ship to go back home, we took off on the Great Circle Route, which is up past the Aleutian Islands. The Aleutian Islands were very stormy seas. This boat was rocking up and down and never got seasick. It was great to see the waves splashing over the bow of the ship and all that, We got into San Francisco. We were on our way home. Went to Camp Shelby, Indiana, which was the base to go to be freed from the Army. I was home again. That was my experience in the military in the Asiatic Pacific Theater. One of my buddies out in the Pacific was this man right here in the picture beside me. Great guy. He served eventually in Europe, in the cleanup forces out there in Czechoslovakia, where he had relatives, and he was a fine man, terrific guy. And when I got home, I went back to work with Fisher Body General Motors Corporation in Cleveland, eventually transferred to the Lordstown plant, and bought a house with my wife in Canfield, Ohio. Beautiful two-story house, and fantastic. Anyhow, life went on. And it wasn't until later on that on our 50th wedding anniversary, we had one of our nephews, several nephews there, our 50th wedding anniversary, and one of the nephews brought this cap in for me. And I never would have bought it myself, but I started wearing it. Before long, I had people coming up and shaking my hands and saying, "Thank you for your service." And I'd say to them, each and every one, "You have a lot of hands to shake," because there were 14 million men in the military, plus all of those fantastic homebodies who filled the factories building bombers and weapons and trucks and everything else that the troops needed to fight the war and win it. So I wear it in honor of the men who served in the military and in the home front, because this war was won by America, by Americans, and all of the people who came here to become Americans, like my wife's parents and my wife, who was born in Czechoslovakia. So that's the story of the war.